So everyone, so thanks again, Nicola, for the invitation, and thanks to the ELINET organizing committee for a wonderful job. It's nice to see that this committee doesn't do things in halves. Most people at a launch of event might do a half-day conference or even a full-day conference if they were ambitious. But no, you know, ELINET being such a wide network, I think it's quite impressive that you're really kicking this off with a 3-day hybrid conference. And so, so I'm sure, you know, anyone that's organized a conference, let alone a multiple day one or a hybrid one, will realize the amount of sheer effort that's gone into this. So thank you once again to the organizing committee. So just as the opening talk for the conference, I was asked to speak a little bit about global English medium instruction to really tie together these two strands. So if you listen to Nicola, the network really started from these two strands, one looking at teaching in English and one looking at teaching English in a global world. So global English is an EMI. And so there are a lot of synergies and similarities in the driving forces between these two, but they are quite separate strands in a way. You know, one's very much about English language teaching, and one's quite separate from English language teaching, but still intertwined in some way. But both are really driven by this kind of notion of internationalization and globalization that has really seen a huge boom of people using English, both in academic settings, but then outside of those settings as well. And so today, our job, Kari and my job, is to try to tie those together. And we're drawing really on a paper that we published recently in Asian Englishes. And so this is why I've also said some contributions of today's talk will also be coming from Sahan, who contributed to that paper with us, tying together the kind of areas of global Englishes and EMI to really understand what global EMI should look like. And so when we talk about global EMI, we're talking about EMI that's rapidly emerging in global contexts due to these kind of top-down and bottom-up policy shifts. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about English medium instruction and global Englishes separately, just to provide a backdrop of information about these two fields. So English medium instruction, I guess if you're at this conference, may not be new, but may be tangential if you're at this conference more interested in global Englishes. What we've seen with EMI is trends towards internationalization, particularly in higher education, and the spread of English as an international language of science and academia. And as a result, a growing number of higher education institutions have elected to teach some or all of their academic subjects through English. And so some, like Chapel, have referred to EMI as the most significant trend in educational internationalization. And we're seeing a kind of rapid emergence of EMI programs around the world. Of course, it's not relegated only to higher education, but a lot of the work that we've been the research has been exploring has been in that higher education setting, mainly because when it comes to other levels of education, such as primary or secondary, it tends to take other forms because there tends to be an understanding that language is more intertwined with the medium of instruction. So we'll see it, come in the forms of more like immersion programs or bilingual programs or perhaps CLIL programs. Whereas EMI, is its current identity, kind of separates itself a little bit from English language with this understanding that if you're in an EMI program, sometimes there's an assumption that your English is good enough. And so not always is the same support there. And so I think with this then comes challenges. So along with these challenges, we've seen research on EMI grow exponentially in the last couple of decades. A controversial definition, and I say controversial because I know there are people that will disagree with it, is Ernesto Macaro's definition, which emerged from the work of the EMI Oxford Research Group. It was defined as the use of English language to teach academic subjects other than English itself in countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English. And so if we see a definition like this, we see that this definition places, well, we've gone way up the screen. This is the old version of my slide, places the emphasis on focusing on content only. And so there's not really any explicit mention of language or language support as intertwined. Different alternative definitions of EMI will see it as closer to CLIL or content-based instruction. such as this one by Taguchi, that says EMI is curricula using English as a medium of instruction for basic and advanced courses to improve students' academic English proficiency. And so we see quite a different definition here that is maybe a little bit more upfront with a lot of institutions' aims, which is actually not to only teach content, but there's an assumption that students' language will develop. And so actually in lockstep, we do find language programs running in parallel to EMI programs in some contexts, but not all. A lot of this drive, there have been a number of driving factors, but we can see the growth of academic English. And so if we look at this share of total academic publications of the last 100 years, according to language, you can see that English is almost, well, has monopolized academic publishing. And so there's this sense then that if students or researchers or people working particularly in higher education settings want access to current knowledge, often that's now only available in English. A lot of it is not even being translated. And so, you know, I think this was one of the original driving forces towards EMI in higher education. We saw it kind of higher research levels, but it's trickled down into other programs, undergraduate programs, and so forth now. And this is mainly because English, you know, EMI is intertwined with internationalization agenda of a lot of universities, and they see this as a kind of, universities will see it as a simple fix, but us in this room will know there's nothing simple about it, right? It comes with a lot of complications of a way to internationalize, that if you Englishize your curriculum, you can increase chances of student mobility, faculty mobility, access to global, you know, knowledge sources, and this will be a way to internationalize. But this comes with challenges, of course. But as a result of this kind of firm belief of Englishization, meaning internationalization, we've seen huge growths in English medium programs. So English taught programs in Europe at the undergraduate level have increased exponentially in a very short period of time, from 55 to 2,900 programs in just a span of 8 years. In China and Japan, we've seen huge policy reforms to encourage EMI at top universities. And then EMI is now this galloping phenomenon. And there are not, as I mentioned, internationalization is just one of the driving forces, and there are many more, some of which was uncovered in that work that Nicola mentioned in her opening that emerged from the Asian context, but I think rings true for a lot of universities around the world, that they see EMI as a way to gain access to cutting edge knowledge, increase global competitiveness, increase income. We see this in places like Japan, where they have a falling domestic student numbers that they're trying to make up with international numbers, enhancing students and lecturer mobility, enhancing employability of graduates, improving English proficiency of graduates, access to up-to-date knowledge and research, and also as a reflection of developments in English language teaching. And a lot of these assumptions, actually, we should say, are largely untested. And so I think there's, there's room for a lot of research to really answer these questions. You know, does EMI truly lead to global competitiveness or enhanced student mobility or better jobs, better income? What we also should understand from the outset is that EMI doesn't come as one form. Okay, it seems to be used as a catch-all term to cover a lot of different models of how EMI is presented in actual curricular developments. And here we've got a little bit of a graph here that maps it onto how language is intertwined with EMI in just 4 models. There are obviously more than just 4 models in work, but these kind of reduce it into 4 main categories. And so we can see some universities will adopt a preparatory year model, which will be similar to what we can see in Turkey. We see that students will take a 1-year intensive pre-sessional program before they enter the EMI program. This, of course, comes with challenges. We see concurrent support models where students take in-sessional language support, so often EAP or ESP, alongside EMI programs. And so in this way, it looks a little bit more like FLIL programs. We see selection models that kind of mimic what we would see in Anglophone universities, where students have to meet specific English proficiency standards before they start. And there's what Ernesto Macaro refers to as the ostrich model, which is basically burying your head in the sand and ignoring all students' needs around language. So you don't require students to receive any kind of proficiency level before entering the university, but you also don't provide them with support. So they're really on their own. And so really it's these top two models that we see that we want to promote in EMI, in that the selection model is largely seen as anti-egalitarian, in that if we're having these proficiency standards, we might be excluding students from certain university programs. And if we believe these assumptions, that EMI, studying an English taught program, leads to higher success, better mobility, better jobs, it's very egalitarian if we're excluding students from the outset based on language alone, on their ability to be an engineer, to be a chemist, to study medicine. And so that's a little look at EMI. Now, what about global Englishes? So global Englishes is an inclusive term that includes the work of a number of related fields. That is World Englishes, with its identification and codification of regional varieties of English. English as a lingua franca, which examines English within and across different borders. And English as an international language, which largely grew out of the North American context as a paradigm for rethinking practice in English language teaching. And so Nicola and I previously have used global Englishes to kind of include a lot of that work, which we see as highly interrelated and important, particularly because there are strong teaching implications of it. The main driving force of interest in global Englishes is the people in this red chart here, which you can't quite see because it's hidden behind there, but that's okay. But basically, the red part of that graph looks at lingua franca speakers, and the blue part of that graph looks at mother tongue speakers of English. And so what we see here is that, lingua franca speakers of English are by far the global majority of English users today. And so this is what we're talking about in terms of the importance of global Englishes for language teaching, that actually a lot of people are going to be, people who are learning English as a global language are going to use English with other people who have learned English as a global language. So therefore, what kind of standards or norms are most important for those learners? And what we've also found, drawing on work from World Englishes, is that the kind of English that is used around the world differs drastically. And this has a lot to do with the way that it was historically spread. And so there are different kind of linguistic processes and historical and political processes that have shaped English over time and have caused, English to be not one single language, standard language, but Englishes. So, it's English in its plurality. Help me say that word, Nicola. Thank you. And it's this one here that we're seeing exponential growth in recent years through globalization. A recent statistic from last year from the ethnologue, language ethnologue, cited that only 4% of English conversations in the world today involve only native speakers. And I find this statistic quite, I actually found it surprising, even as a researcher of global Englishes. And so people that are going out to use English in the world today, actually, those using English as a lingua franca are now in the majority. And so what cannot be denied is what is taught in traditional ELT classrooms is very different to how the language is being used outside of the classroom. And I think this is where we see the kind of changes that have been lobbied in global Englishes to make the kind of realities of the classroom more reflective of what's happening outside of the classroom if students are going to go on to use English as a global language. So a lot of this English, this research then has boomed in recent decades, and we've seen some pockets of a lot of hot activity, as Nicola mentioned. We see a lot of intense research coming out of places like Thailand, Germany, and some other contexts in recent years, which is really exciting because this is kind of in the classroom research, grassroots research that the field really needs. And so what this research really does is call for greater acceptance of the diverse global realities of what English is, who uses the language, where it is used, and how it is used. And so some of this has been summed up in proposals for change, which Nicola and I summed up in our Introducing Global Englishes book and have built on since, where we call for some curricular changes in English language classrooms. And these include increase in world Englishes and ELF exposure in the curricula, emphasizing respect for multilingualism, raising awareness of global Englishes directly with students, talking to them about how English is used directly so that they're kind of aware of how they're going to need to use it in the future, raising awareness of ELF strategies. And these ELF strategies are different from general communication strategies, which tended to kind of really connect with communicating with native speakers. But ELF strategies will be quite different. Students will need strategies of, what do they do when they're communicating with somebody who they perceive as having quite a strong accent, or their accent is perceived quite strongly? What if they're communicating with somebody with lower proficiency than themselves or higher proficiency than themselves, or that have come from quite a different linguistic community where there are different norms of the way that they use English? And so they need different set of sub-strategies there. Also emphasizing respect for diverse English using cultures and communities. So the sense that, an English speaking community can exist anywhere in the world today. So just because you're teaching English in Japan, like I once did, it doesn't mean that there are English using opportunities, right on the student's doorstep in terms of InfoQ itself in Japan, and changing teaching hiring practices. And so a lot of these kind of proposals have been wrapped up in a framework, which we've called the Global Englishes Language Teaching Framework. And this emerged from Nicola's early work in 2011, from his doctoral work, and then we've built on it in subsequent years. But basically, it's outlining various dimensions associated with English language teaching, and where we hope to move from and where we hope to move towards. And so this is not intended, even though it's laid out on a table, it's not intended to be a black or white, all or nothing table. And so we've often talked to teachers before that even if you can make small changes in some of these categories, we feel like it will have a positive influence of kind of globalizing the curriculum. We realize, you can't do all of these things at once. It takes time. And so we've seen a lot of work emerge. If you're interested in reading more about implications for language teaching, we have Nicola and my book where we focus specifically on language teaching, but a lot of really interesting work coming out of other areas of the world. And so there's a particularly good book here, an edited volume that looks at critical perspectives of global Englishes in Asia. So now that we've looked at global Englishes in EMI, where does it meet at the crossroads? What are the similarities between the two? There are several shared concepts that underpin both global Englishes and EMI, and hence there are opportunities for greater synergies between the two fields. So both fields focus on phenomena that have emerged in lockstep with economic and political globalization, and in many ways, colonialism before that. And so there are kind of areas of tension and resistance that we have to be aware of both EMI and global Englishes. Both establish a primary focus of research attention within the non-Anglophone national context. Both seek implications for the betterment of educational practices, and both are astutely aware of the importance of multilingualism in a seemingly English-centric field of studies. So even though both these fields have English in them, both have embraced multilingualism as a core feature of their presentation and practice. Due to these shared endeavors, the aim of this presentation is to bring together key concepts at the crossroad of global Englishes and EMI to reveal shared critical perspectives to inform best practices in a global, and what I want to focus on here today is a non-Western centric positioning of EMI. And so that's our challenge today, to kind of uncover some of those perspectives. We're going to talk about 3 today, and then kind of open it up to the room to talk about other areas where you can see kind of shared perspectives between the two fields. But today we're going to talk mainly about shared agendas when it comes to multilingualism and pedagogical practices, shared agendas when it comes to challenging native speaker hegemony, and challenges to the center-periphery views that highlight a shift of power from the Anglosphere. And so I'm handing it over to Kari in the next section.
Okay, thank you, Heath. So as Heath said, we'll be talking about 3 shared concepts between global Englishes and EMI to get at this idea of what global EMI might look like. And the first of those concepts that we want to talk about is the idea of multilingualism. Now, global Englishes has been heavily influenced by the work of Kanagaraja, as well as current understandings of translanguaging and the multilingual turn in applied linguistics. So I've got a quote up here from Kanagaraja that summarizes that idea. And he says that there is now a growing realization that English cannot be separated from other languages. This is true not only of the contemporary global contact zones where languages intermingle, but of all communication because languages are always in contact. So from this idea, we get the idea that there's never going to be just English. We're not going to have a situation where it's just English by itself, but we're always going to have this situation in which languages are interacting. And that is why multilingualism is at the forefront of work on global Englishes. Oops, see if I can work this. Similarly, global Englishes has been informed by a lot of research in relation to the multilingual turn in applied linguistics, and much of that has called for changes within the field of English language teaching, specifically for ELT to be more inclusive of teachers and students' knowledges of other languages, including their first language. We'll come back to this idea a little bit later when I talk about native speakerism. But drawing on these ideas, scholarship on global Englishes has explored plurilingual as well as translingual practices of speakers who use English as a global lingua franca. However, this body of research is not without critique, and that's where we want to start our focus on multilingualism today. Some scholars, especially those from the global South, so again, moving away from that Western-centric focus, they have criticized this idea of a multilingual turn as being Western-centric. Specifically, Sugiharato called the multilingual turn a vacuous concept because he says that it ignores the deep realities of multilingualism that are a rich part and an ongoing part of the history of many parts of the world. So the idea of there being a multilingual turn assumes that at some point, we didn't have multilingualism, and then suddenly we turned around and realized that multilingualism exists. But for many parts of the world, certainly throughout the global South, as well as in many post-colonial contexts, multilingualism is a reality. And so if we take that as our starting point, this idea of suddenly embracing multilingualism is ignoring the fact that millions and millions of people live their lives multilingually and have been doing so for a very long time. So for us as scholars, we need to pause and we need to ask ourselves whether our research, including our research that embraces this multilingualism, is actually perpetuating some of these Western-centric ideas of colonial hegemony, Eurocentrism, and elitism. So even if we're saying, look, this is multilingual, are we doing that from this Western-centric perspective, or are we actually embracing the multilingualism that exists in these contexts? So that was the challenge that Heath, Sahan, and I set out in that paper that Heath mentioned at the beginning of this talk. And so over the next couple of slides, I'm going to try and walk you through this, through our thinking, with examples of translingual and multilingual practices from EMI research in non-Western contexts. And as you are probably familiar with, if you're in this room, there's a lot of really great research in this area. I've pulled up, thrown them on the slide here. There's a lot of really great research coming from non-Western contexts. So I've got some studies here that come from Nepal, some from Hong Kong and mainland China. I think I don't know if I've got Turkey here as well, but there's lots of great research in many different contexts. And I'm going to walk you through some of what we see when we look at this research on translanguaging in EMI. The first thing that I want to acknowledge is that research has found that teachers and students are generally really positive towards this idea of translanguaging. So we see not only that translanguaging is a reality in EMI classrooms, but then teachers and students, they embrace this, they say that they like it, and they say that they do it. And that exists even in places where we have top-down policies that are enforcing this monolingual English-only idea. One study that has found such things is the study here. This comes from the work that Heath and Sahan did along with Jim. Hi, Jim. You'll hear from him later today. But in this study involved over 500 students in China, and they found that these students overwhelmingly agreed, I think it was 85% of students agreed that the first language should be used in class, and that it not only should be used by teachers, but that students themselves should also be using the first language in EMI contexts. So we're getting right there, this idea that EMI does not have to be English only, that it can be multilingual and it can embrace the local language. When we look at this research overall, what we see is that it's shifting our understanding of what translanguaging or first language use means in EMI contexts, away from the idea of coping with low English proficiency. So a lot of the research that maybe looks at L1 use or frames L1 use in EMI contexts starts from the perspective that, well, students have low English proficiency, and so they need to use the first language. But that's a very deficit view of multilingualism. That's saying your English isn't good enough, therefore you must use your other languages. Actually, what this research on multilingualism in EMI is showing us is that translanguaging doesn't have to take that deficit view, but it can be a very helpful pedagogical practice to co-construct meaning. And I've put on the slide here many of the different ways in which that research has shown us that multilingual practices are useful. So that can include playful talk, whole body sense making. Research has shown that it can assist with word search sequences. So not just, you don't know the first language, but it can help build this interaction. It can also be very helpful in contexts where you may have migrant students or international students who don't share the first language with the teacher. So it doesn't need to be a shared language, but you can still use translanguaging to draw on the multilingual resources in the classroom. It can also contribute to dynamic interactions. And research has suggested that by encouraging students to draw on both their everyday knowledge of their first language, the everyday words they use, as well as those academic words, this can really enhance their meaning making in science classrooms. And research has also suggested that through translanguaging practices, we often see more higher order questions in EMI science classrooms. So that research on translanguaging, it tells us that not only are EMI classrooms inherently multilingual, but we also see that that in many of these classrooms, the teachers and the students share the first language. So it's not that we necessarily have an international class where everybody is speaking different languages, but it might be a context in which nearly all of the students, or perhaps even all of them, have the same first language as the teacher. And that is shifting our understanding of what global EMI is away from this Eurocentric understanding that EMI results from having high levels of international students. So EMI is not necessarily the result of international student mobility. We're not necessarily using English in the classroom because it's the only lingua franca available to everybody. Now, obviously, and of course, there are international students in contexts around the world, including these contexts in Asia that we looked at in this paper. But when we look at this work on translanguaging, we're seeing that the decision to teach through English, it's part of a really complex sociolinguistic situation. And there's many factors that go into decision-making when it comes to EMI. So it's not just that necessity of international students. And that understanding of multilingualism, it opens new spaces for critical research that challenges the notion of EMI being a monolingual endeavor, and it challenges the notion of English being that necessary contact language because of international students. It also challenges the idea of the first language not being possible because of international students. We're really seeing that there's a whole range of ways in which multilingual practices are manifested in EMI contexts. And this research is showing us that translanguaging practices can be very empowering to the multilingual teachers and students that use them in EMI classrooms. So I want to move now to that second concept that he introduced at the beginning, and that's this idea of native speakerism. Before I begin talking about native speakerism, I'd like you to just take a few minutes to look at the titles that I've got here on the slide. These come from various textbooks or posters in different contexts. And you might notice things like which is right, how to be correct in English, student error correction guidebook, learn English 300% faster. Most common mistakes made by non-native speakers of English, there's very much an idea of correctness, rightness. And if we look at the images of the people who are used on the slide, we see that they all sort of look the same way, don't they? Well, those examples point to this idea of native speakerism. native speakerism is an ideology that refers to the native speaker, and that really should be in scare quotes because we can problematize who is a native speaker, but it refers to that native speaker as the ideal representative of the language and culture. Now, this has very negative consequences for language users who are not categorized as that native speaker. And so it leads to an othering, and it creates a separation between members of a linguistic and a professional community. In other words, if you're a teacher, you're either going to be categorized as a native speaker or a non-native speaker. And the ways in which those categories are constructed can be very problematic. However, despite that, we still see that attachments to native speakerism exist throughout the world. They're very pervasive in different global contexts. So I'll share with you a couple of examples from around the globe there. These are different advertisements that we've seen for English speakers in the ELT job market. You can see from this advertisement in Poland, they want a native speaker of English with a neutral accent. Whatever a neutral accent means, I'm not quite sure who in this room would be categorized as having a neutral accent. We also see from places in Japan, a native English speaker and university degree is required, education preferred. So the preference there first is on that native speakerism, that university degree and the field of education, that's really secondary. First, it's the idea of that native speaker. And then in China, something quite similar to what we saw in that Poland example, a native English speaker with a neutral native dialect. I don't know what counts as a native dialect, and I don't know what counts as neutral there, but they're looking for someone who has that. So when we look at these examples, we see that on a global level, the ELT profession might be the only profession in the world in which the majority of its professionals face discrimination. So most English teachers in the world do not have that native neutral dialect that are advertised here, and yet they're discriminated against. The preference really is for someone who has whatever it means to be a native speaker. Now, when we look at that, Ali Fouad Selvi tells us that this idea of native speakerism, it's creating inequalities in ELT hiring practices. And that's because the recruitment values that are being reported inside of these advertisements are for nativeness of the teacher, and they're based on the variety of English that that person speaks over their other qualifications. This creates a barrier of professional employment for the majority of teachers. And we should also note that in addition to accent, these are often coded as well in racial terms. So if you think back to the pictures that I had on that original slide, a lot of white, blonde, light-eyed people, and that is that idealized version of what it means to be a native speaker. And as we all know, that has nothing to do with teaching ability, and it might not even have anything to do with, that person being a native speaker. Global Englishes challenges this, and that's because Global Englishes, instead of prioritizing that idealized native speaker, it sees the multilingual English teacher as the ideal role model for English language users. If you think back to some of the graphs that Heath was sharing earlier and some of the statistics he showed us, most conversations in English are not going to be between these two blonde-haired, blue-eyed, neutral native accent speakers. Instead, they're going to be between people from diverse communities, from different cultural backgrounds, with different language backgrounds. And so that multilingual English teacher is going to be more likely to represent an authentic global user of English. So if we shift now from Global Englishes to EMI, many of the questions that relate to native speakerism are prevalent in EMI contexts. However, they remain less explored in this field. Particularly with respect to teacher recruitment, there has not been the same level of debate or research as we see in the field of ELT. We do have some evidence that native speakerism is very strong when it comes to hiring practices in EMI, and this is very concerning. So a study that we did a couple of years ago now, it was a global mapping study. I'll be talking about this in more detail tomorrow, but that study looked at 52 different nations and looked at the implementation of EMI there. And what we found is that in many contexts, there was really a preference for hiring EMI teachers who had received their postgraduate degrees from Anglophone universities. or who had some kind of overseas study and work experience. And we would argue that this coding of Anglophone university, this coding of overseas work experience, it's native speakerism masked again. There's this idea that if you go abroad and you study here at the University of Glasgow, somehow your English is going to be so much better than if you had stayed in your home country and done a PhD there. And that's simply by the fact that you stood in this native speaker space for some amount of time. Nicola and I also worked on a study in Vietnam and Thailand, and we found something really similar there. We found that in Vietnam and Thailand, both countries considered a degree from abroad as an essential requirement for EMI teachers. So again, that idea of needing to have gotten your degree from an Anglophone country. But also in this study, we asked teachers and students what traits made someone a successful EMI teacher. And they didn't say native speaker, they didn't say native accent. Those were very low in terms of their preferences. So there's a tension here between hiring practices that are saying, you need to reach this idea of native, whatever that is, and what teachers and students are actually recognizing as being necessary on the ground. So to pull that all together, we are seeing some evidence of ways in which native speakerism is resisted in EMI. Research has indicated that EMI teachers perceive a difference between the English proficiency that is needed to, for example, present at an academic conference and the proficiency that's needed to teach an EMI course. This is suggesting that EMI practitioners realize that English is not some monolith, but rather that there are differences in terms of teaching through English and just having a high proficiency of English. That nuance has also been found in other ways. A study of EMI secondary schools in China found that science lessons, which were taught by native English-speaking teachers, tended to have less student interaction, and they tended to be more teacher-centric compared to other classrooms in which we did not have those native English-speaking teachers. Now, this research is telling us that native English-speaking status alone, or even just high English proficiency, is not enough to necessarily improve the quality or the quantity of interaction in EMI classes. So from studies such as this, we're seeing that just having high proficiency or being a native speaker doesn't mean that you're doing a better job in terms of teacher-student interaction in the classroom or in terms of engaging the students in EMI classes. But rather, multilingual teachers may be able to facilitate richer interaction through translanguaging practices. And that ties back to a lot of the research we looked at earlier on multilingualism. However, as I noted earlier, the role of native speakerism in EMI, particularly in terms of hiring practices that discriminate against non-native English speakers, has not been thoroughly interrogated. We've looked at this in far more detail in the field of ELT, and so more research is warranted in this area. I'm going to pass back off to Heath now to look at our third bookmark.
Kari. Okay, I might need to move this again. Yes. Yep. Okay. Great. So yes, so for the final point, we want to look at this notion of resisting the center periphery of English, which is a real central notion of global Englishes, and we would argue should also be a central notion of what is a global version of EMI. So center periphery derives from world systems theory and responds to models of unequal power that separate often Western and non-Western countries, with especially powerful Anglophone countries at the core of the center. And we often see, contexts such as the UK and the US in particular being located in that, what they consider that powerful center of knowledge that the world is looking to for information. So global Englishes has often been seen to challenge this and to interrogate those unequal relationships in a way to empower the periphery. And so a lot of the work in global Englishes has happened in the periphery for this reason, as grassroots initiatives to try to empower knowledge centers of what, global Englishes language teaching might look like in contexts such as Japan. In Nicola and my case, we started our research there, but other work that's going on in Thailand and Germany and so forth. So what we see is that in the TESOL industry, this is quite, this is quite a powerful notion to find resistance against, because there are definitely powerful centers of English. And as Kari mentioned, these tend to be highly connected with this notion of where native speakers are and what are considered native speaking countries. And these have the lion's share of influence, while others relegated to the periphery don't seem to have that influence and are seen to have to draw from those knowledge centers to inform, say, ELT practices, to draw teaching resources from, and so forth. And so what we would argue in global Englishes is that there's a need to that there's an imbalance in power between the center and periphery, which feeds into all related decisions in English language teaching and policy and practice. In early conceptualizations of global Englishes, these were underpinned by the writings of Kanagaraja, who argued that if English teaching in periphery countries is to be conducted in a socially responsible and politically empowering manner, the authority of conceiving and implementing the curriculum and pedagogy should be passed on to the local teachers themselves. And so there's this notion that, we need to shift away this center of knowledge from, the central core countries to the periphery and actually to the teachers themselves, because it's the teachers themselves in the English language classrooms that might best understand what their students need, how their students are going to use language in the future. What we then would argue, though, maybe we need to see a similar kind of movement for EMI, to empower EMI teachers that are at the forefront of EMI practice, that really understand what students need, rather than drawing on these powerful, centers of knowledge for knowledge and expertise. And so center periphery dynamics also underpin EMI, quite powerfully so. And especially because of neoliberal higher education that we can see as quite pervasive in the EMI sector. So Xin Shu wrote in 2020, the world of academic knowledge is not a level playing field, but more closely approximates the center periphery dynamic described in world systems theory, in which countries on the periphery must work within world system framed by the center countries. And we can see this not only in EMI, but all aspects of neoliberal higher education. You can just look at the research and publishing sector. We see where the kind of powerful knowledge centers of academic publishing are located, mainly in the UK, mainly in the US. If not in those contexts, then some other powerful centers, such as in Germany and the Netherlands. And the rest of the world has to play this game, but actually it's an unfair game. And so we see this also with EMI. That EMI has been criticized by researchers to reflect a neo-colonial mentality, which may reduce knowledge production in local language and commercialize English and higher education. That, with EMI, if all of the resources and all the knowledge about teaching and learning through English are located in these Anglophone center countries, then it's kind of reducing kind of knowledge production in those local languages. EMI's reliance on Western texts might also Westernize students and detach them from local perspectives if they're only to be drawing on textbooks that are coming from these center countries. Pramad Shah says EMI is a kind of quasi-colonialism in that resource-poor nations look to external foreign knowledge sources and materials to create the curriculum. And so he was particularly talking about the context of Nepal. So inequalities are also central to driving forces of EMI. So to compete in global job markets, many universities offer EMI programs as a form of internationalization at home, where international, and this is operationalized as English medium courses, are offered to local students in a bid to emulate the experiences of gaining an international degree. And I think this is where we see this problem, that if it's to emulate, then always these, the kind of power balance will always not be in favor of the periphery. If it's just trying to copy, the kind of experience that one might get coming to the UK to do a degree, say, rather than taking advantage of kind of the unique contextual factors that might be available to students that are studying in a multilingual, global context in other nations. So in Kirkpatrick's review of EMI in universities in East and Southeast Asia, he observes that EMI has developed at the expense of local languages in academia and introduces English ways of thinking into the curriculum. And so we would argue then if EMI is uncritically adopted from center countries by the periphery, it may propagate colonization of the minds, of the curriculum, of those working in studying within these systems. And so this is something that we need to be astutely aware of. So we would argue that EMI policy would benefit by disrupting the current world system by looking to local and neighboring sources of knowledge for policy making and best practice. So this notion of not looking to the centers to inform EMI practice. So, if you're doing an English taught program in a business department in Japan, you have some unique on the ground local issues. Perhaps you're not going to find those answers by parachuting in some, EMI teacher trainers from the UK and America that have come from quite different contexts. You might want to look at comparable contexts in neighboring countries, within universities, within your own context, that are grappling with the same situations, and then developing a kind of best practice that is locally informed, but is globally relevant. And so, a truly global EMI will be seen to develop policy and practice in this way. And so research across the global south has demonstrated that the needs of EMI are very context specific, and there is a no one size fits all model. And so we really need to be looking at each context of EMI as not unique, because it is unique in itself. And you can see, even if you go into one country, you can, or even within one university, you might find quite different challenges from one department to another, depending on how things are set up, let alone one country to another. But it's about making those connections with locally relevant universities and programs so that best practice can emerge. So this has prompted some scholars, such as Richard and Jack Pun, to devise a typology of EMI that can be used as a navigator to guide curriculum planners, as well as content and language teachers, to find suitable set of parameters to implement effective EMI teaching according to their cultural and classroom contexts. So that then we start to compare life with life in terms of programs. You might be able to compare programs that will be sharing the same problems and looking for shared solutions. And in this way, we can have a better understanding of the differences and similarities of EMI across contexts, which can help policymakers seek answers for best practice from knowledge sources in the periphery that may be striving to meet similar educational outcomes that contend with comparable socio-political tensions. And this was actually one of the driving forces of a recent paper that the EMI Oxford Research Group worked on. And this was a way to try to look at dimensions where EMI might differ, so that we can start to, when we're looking at comparative EMI programs, that you can compare like programs with like programs. So for example, if you're an EMI program that is very typified by multilingual or bilingual practices, which are some of the work that Kari had mentioned, we do see EMI programs where multilingualism, bilingualism is part and parcel of those programs, that if you're going to be looking for solutions to the problems you're having in those contexts, you might want to try to look at other contexts that are underpinned by these multilingual, bilingual practices. And so it's about finding, suitable EMI contexts where best practices can be shared. And so a lot of this paper, the driving force of this paper emerged out of conversations about whether Anglophone countries should be considered EMI. And so I think that our research group takes quite a strong position on that we see EMI as a kind of phenomenon that, it's this phenomenon of students switching to English. But I think as a result, a lot of people with the momentum of EMI research, a lot of people are using this as a kind of catch-all term to also be looking at kind of issues that may underpin, second language, academic language readiness to study through English. And if that's your topic of research, then there could be parallels that could be drawn with what's happening in Anglophone contexts. So it's about ensuring that your EMI program is at least shares some of these dimensions with other programs where you're drawing knowledge from. And so for some of these might be, center countries. For others, there might be better comparable local contexts. So what we see, moving on to global Englishes and EMI synergies. So we see some shared agendas, just as global Englishes has challenged native speaker hegemony and the centrality of English inner circle norms of global needs, so should EMI resist the relevance of inner circle solutions for their local higher education contexts. To extend Kanagaraja's views of resistance in language education, a socially responsible and politically empowering implementation of EMI should see authority given to local teachers and academic staff for conceiving and implementing the appropriate curriculum and pedagogy to meet their students' needs. And importantly, this should be shared. EMI implementation needs to value the role of both bottom-up policy making and informing best practice, especially in contexts where teachers adapt or disregard ill-fitting top-down policy when addressing immediate classroom learning needs. And so what we did at the end of that paper in Asian Englishes was to look at a framework for conceptualizing global EMI. And really at this point, I would say it's not a framework. This is really a think piece, right? Potentially about what it could look like. And we did this by looking at those dimensions of the Global English as Language Teaching Framework and saw, well, how many of these seem to be relevant for EMI? And so looking at these possibilities, we concluded that global EMI should be seen as owned by a global academic community. So it's not the property of the Anglosphere, but also not, it's not excluding it either and its knowledge bases. It's inclusive of diverse educational cultures, so it does not require nations to adopt foreign pedagogies to get the job done. It's flexible in its norms of practice and takes on multiple forms. There's no one-size-fits-all model. It places importance on qualified, competent teachers, so it does not place greater importance on recruitment of native English-speaking teachers or teachers with degrees from Anglophone countries. If you want the best and competent chemistry EMI teacher, you need a competent chemistry teacher that can teach through English. Where they did their degree should be irrelevant. It looks to local communities and salient comparable contexts for sources of learning materials, so it doesn't uncritically borrow from centers of knowledge. It views knowledge of other languages and cultures as a resource and encourages students and teachers to make full use of their linguistic repertoires. It defines the needs of students based on local and local demands, so it does not uncritically emulate foreign curricular outcomes. It views the goal of EMI as developing multi-competent graduates, so it does not see the achievement of native-like proficiency as the central goal, and is multilingual and translingual in orientation. So they were some of our ideas, and as I said, this was intended to be just an initial thought piece. We've talked a lot about English language and internationalization, which is the ELI part of ELINET. For the last part of the presentation, I want to focus on the net part of ELINET, which is network. And that's getting you to engage and talk with each other about, you can use the GELT framework as a starting point, but I really am interested in what ways we can ensure EMI is dynamic and global construct that does not critically emulate or uncritically adopt from centers of knowledge. You can use the same dimensions to focus on discussions or adapt or create new dimensions of importance to EMI. The QR link here, if you have a device that can scan a QR link, will take you to a Google document where you can have a look at some of those dimensions, and it would be quite interesting. I know we're kind of short on time, but even if you wrote in some notes into that table, after about 10 minutes, we can come back and share some of the ideas that have been generated. If you have the QR code, and obviously it's a very small screen, so I apologize for that. There is also a link here, but you won't be able to click on that, so that won't be helpful to you at all. But that's the Google Doc there. The Google Doc shows you, there's just the GELT framework there as a reference point. And then we have on the next page, dimensions of global EMI, and lots of blank spaces for other dimensions where you think it's quite important. You would see quite important to underpin a global EMI. And so have a chat with the people around you, and hopefully you can populate this table. And then we'll come back in about 10 minutes to share ideas. Does that sound good?